It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC CQ27G2U, or as it's known in some regions, simply the CQ27G2. This monitor uses a curved Samsung SVA panel, that's super vertical alignment, with a 2560 by 1440 WQHD resolution and a 144Hz refresh rate. As usual, there is a written review which accompanies the video, or as I prefer to say, this video accompanies a written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on YouTube, and it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on. So in no way does it give you an exact representation of what the screen would look like firsthand. To start off, look a little bit at the curve. It's a 1500R curve, so that's a moderate curvature, a 27-inch screen, so it's not an ultra wide or anything like that. It's not a super huge screen, and that means that the curvature is not actually that pronounced. It's something which I adapted to very readily. It's something which I'm actually not really consciously aware of when I'm using the monitor anymore. So I certainly wouldn't be put off the idea of a curved monitor if you haven't used one, or if you've looked at videos and pictures of the monitor where you can see this kind of weird pincushion effect. When you're actually in front of the monitor looking at it, you don't notice that at all. That's not what you see, and it really just draws you in a little bit, the curve, to the experience, but it doesn't feel unnatural or anything like that. And actually, some studies suggest it could promote enhanced viewing comfort, as well as drawing you into the experience a little bit more. So there are some benefits to the curve, but really it's not something that you should be put off, unless you're needing geometric perfection for whatever reason. Perhaps you're a designer, or you've used curved monitors before, and by used I mean you've sat down at a desk, you've used one for a number of days, and you just don't get on with it, then that's fine. Look at flat alternatives, but for everyone else, I'd say give it a go. Another aspect that I like to mention quite early on is the screen surface. It's a light matte anti-glare finish, as usual for a VA panel, and as I usually find with the 27-inch WQHD VA panels, it has a little bit of a graininess to it. It's not a strong graininess, it's not a smeary look to it, so it doesn't look like there's a sort of window of graininess in front of the image and the image is behind that or anything like that, but it doesn't have quite the same smooth look that you get with some of the IPS type alternatives, and even some of the TN alternatives, such as the Dell S2719DGF, but it is something I'm very sensitive to. I don't find this particularly obnoxious. Yes, I do kind of notice a bit of graininess, but it's a fairly light graininess, and most users are going to find this just fine. In fact, I'd say that most aren't even going to notice it at all. The 2560 by 1440 WQHD resolution, that gives you a good amount of desktop real estate, so it's good for work purposes, multitasking, and it gives you a decent level of clarity, and things are a nice size without scaling for most people. So it certainly has some advantages over the full HD resolution, and it's kind of a comfortable spot for many people to be in, really. I quite like it on the desktop. Of course, there are models with higher pixel density and high resolutions, 4K UHD models for example, but for many the WQHD resolution is a nice happy medium between full HD and 4K UHD. And it's certainly easier to drive than the 4K UHD resolution at relatively high frame rates. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it has a slightly gamery look. It's mainly matte black plastic, but it does have some red elements. They're a kind of dark metallic effect red. They don't actually stand out as much in practice as they tend to in photos and videos, and especially press photos of the monitor. So there's a red stripe there at the bottom of the monitor. And then there's also the red ring where the stand base attaches to the neck. The stand base itself has a sort of star-shaped design. With the CG27G2, not the model with the U at the end, the base is actually a silver colour rather than black, as you see here on the U model. The top and side bezels are quite slender. They have a dual stage design. So there is a panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, and you can see that it's quite well blended when the monitor's switched off as it is now, but when it's switched on you can see that around the image, and there's a hard, thin plastic outer component as well. Something I like to point out as well, you might notice there's a little notch. It looks like there's a tiny section missing, really tiny in this case, just on the top right corner and the top left. That's a calibration mark used by the machine that puts everything together. Another calibration mark used on Samsung SVA panels, like the one that this monitor uses. There's also a very dark, slender blue line running on the panel border itself. It's really very difficult to see, very well blended indeed. If light strikes it at just the right angle, you can see it. It may not come across on the video, pretty subtle, but anyway, completely normal. The monitor also has a 1500R curve, and I mentioned that earlier, and I said that I don't really find it massively changes the experience, just draws you in a little bit. I wouldn't worry about it. It tends to look exaggerated in videos and photos of the monitor, but in reality it's a pretty subtle addition really, and you get used to it quite quickly. I certainly did. I've just managed to get a good shot showing the blue line just there. You can see it at the top as well, it's not just at the sides. So normal usage, really very subtle, very difficult to see. People don't usually notice it at all. The screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so it offers decent glare handling. This is a fairly bright room, so you will see some glare as I move around, but when I was using the monitor normally I didn't have an issue with this. It certainly doesn't give you the kind of sharp reflections you'd get on a glossy screen surface or anything like that. It doesn't offer quite as strong glare handling as some matte screen surfaces, but there are advantages to that as I explore elsewhere in the review. The monitor is pretty slim at the side really. It lumps out centrally where the stand attaches. The included stand offers good ergonomic flexibility. I'll show you that when I've got the monitor facing away from me, but you can tilt it, you can adjust the height, and you can also swivel it left and right. The actual measurements for these adjustments are given in the written review. At the rear, it's mainly matte black plastic, but there are some of those dark red metallic elements in full force at the back here. I don't really care for them either way. My wall sees these elements. I don't actually see them myself because of how I've got the monitor positioned, so they don't really bother me either way. So the stand attaches centrally. There's a quick release mechanism to release it, and if you just push that switch up, you can take the screen off, and that will reveal 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. The included stand, the adjustability I mentioned before, you can tilt the screen backwards and also forwards a little bit, and you can adjust the height. The various measurements given in the written review like I mentioned before, and it includes the depth of the stand and that kind of thing, and the height of the monitor when it's at the lowest stand height, and how much clearance you have between the desk and the bottom of the screen if you do that. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, certainly check out the written review for that. There's also a cable tidy loop at the bottom, a little hexagonal design where you can feed the cables through to keep them a little bit neater. There's a Kensington lock slot, a K slot. The U model also has integrated speakers, which are found here, they're up firing. They just offer very basic sound output, and that's explored a little bit in the written review. Really nothing to shout about, but you can use them in a pinch. The regular model without the U at the end, that doesn't include the integrated speakers. The ports face downwards. There are USB ports, and these again, they're only found on the U model. So things that distinguish the U model: the colour of the stand will be silver rather than black. You don't get these USB ports, and you don't get those integrated speakers. The actual screen itself, how it's tuned, everything else is or certainly should be very similar. The product's basically the same except for these slight additions with the U model. And the U model is the one you'll get in Europe, whereas elsewhere, I'm not sure if any other territories have the U model, but North America certainly doesn't get it, and I'm quite sure Asia Pacific gets the regular model as well. So anyway, these are USB 3 ports. That one there, the yellow coloured one, has rapid charging for connected devices. There's also an upstream USB port. The two USB 2.0 ports and DisplayPort 1.2a. These all support the full capabilities of the monitor, so you've got 2560 by 1440 at up to 144 Hz. You've also got support for adaptive sync, and that includes AMD FreeSync via HDMI and DisplayPort, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode just over DisplayPort. There's also a 3.5mm headphone jack. You might be able to see that just there. Maybe get a better view around the other side. Yeah, little black jack there. And there is a DC power input, which means the monitor has an external power brick rather than an internal converter. And for those who are interested, this is the power brick just here. Fairly chunky thing. And just to finish off this section, to give you a bit of a better view of the curve of the monitor, Again, it's exaggerated when you look at videos and pictures, although it's a fair representation from this angle, but when you're just using the screen normally from the front, you really don't notice it to such an extent. I'm now going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor, and because it's a VA vertical alignment panel, I have to talk a little bit about something called black crush. By the way, if you see little lines anywhere in the video, for example, you can see some little lines there perhaps, they're just more away from the camera, they're not actually anything that you can see on the monitor itself. So black crush, this is whereby dark shades, which are lighter than black, but only slightly lighter than black, they blend into a sort of black mass. They appear darker than they should. The perceived gamma for those shades is higher, in other words, than it should be. And that's for the region of the screen you're looking at directly, so the sort of central region of the screen, or a little bit higher up, a little bit above center, if you consider an ergonomically correct viewing position where you'd be having your eyes a little bit higher up than center. This is something that affects all VA models. This one, it's not affected badly by it. It is still there, and it is a feature, so to speak, but it's as low as I've seen from a VA model, and I'd say the same about many modern Samsung SVA models. Some of the older VA panels and some VA panels used in TVs still, they tend to have stronger black crush, but on these Samsung SVA panels it's really not too bad, but it is still there. I've got a nice little way of demonstrating it. I've often tried to demonstrate it in videos in the past and it's very difficult. It doesn't always come across on the camera. I think this test should show it quite nicely, but I've never actually tried it on a camera, so I'm not sure how it's going to appear. But there's a black square here with very dark grey text which says PCM on it, and that might be visible to the camera at the moment, I'm not sure, but it'll be only very faint. Certainly to my eye it's very faint, whereas if you show that same text lower down the screen, you actually see the text is more visible. We should be able to see that. Basically this veil of black crush is lifted, but actually the lower regions of the screen on VA models like this, the perceived gamma is a little bit lower than it should be, so things go the other way and actually get a bit too much detail, a bit of unintended detail in places. And I'll go through this with some in-game examples as well, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's a relatively minor factor on this model, but it is something to be aware of still, and it's a sort of gamma inconsistency which you wouldn't have on an IPS type model. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. Contrast is really the strength, the main strength of VA panels like this, and with this one I recorded a bit above 2800 to 1 using my test settings, so much stronger performance than you'd see from any non-VA LCD panel without some very fancy backlighting technology. That gives a nice atmospheric look to games like this. There are plenty of dark scenes, tombs and dark passageways, dark interior locations, just various mixed content, like this scene here for example. And these are displayed nicely on this monitor. It gives a good atmosphere, the brighter elements stand out well against darker surroundings, and the shadow details are a bit better defined than on models with lower static contrast. But there are some weaknesses to be aware of. Black crush, as I'd already mentioned. So there's a nice demonstration of that here. There are some plants against a very dark wall here, and you can see the levels of detail centrally or higher up the screen, which is in line with your eyes or in line with the camera in this case. The level of detail there is worse than it is lower down the screen. You can see a lot more detail revealed. As I mentioned, lower down the screen and actually towards the sides as well, towards the edges of the screen, there's actually a little bit more detail than there should be, but this isn't extreme. This is something which can bring out compression artifacts if you're looking at heavily compressed streamed content, for example. And this is something which I notice very readily on TN models, and that's because they have much lower perceived gamma towards the bottom of the screen than they should have. But on VA models like this, it's not as pronounced as that, so you do get a little bit of this extra detail, and things aren't quite as masked as they should be lower down, but it's not really enough to spoil the experience in my opinion. And the black crush in general on this model is not extreme. So yes, there is a difference comparing lower down the screen to the central region or the region directly in line with your eyes, but it's not really something which I think detracts too much from the overall atmosphere. I'm now on a predominantly darker scene, and I'd like to talk a bit about VA glow. So this is a sort of bloom you see on VA models like this, which is most dominant towards the bottom of the screen, towards the bottom corners in particular, from a normal viewing position. This is exaggerated on the camera, and it's certainly exaggerated further up the screen on the camera, but it is something which I do notice, and it does affect the atmosphere. But it's something which is usually quite a feature on 27-inch VA models like this, and actually this one's not too bad. It's better than, for example, the Samsung C27G2 which I tested, and perhaps a little bit better than the AOC CQ27G2 And it does affect the atmosphere if you're looking at very dark scenes or very dark elements, and you're sitting in a dark room like I am now. But it doesn't bloom as much as IPS glow, it's not as intense, and it doesn't affect as much of the screen. However, because the static contrast is stronger centrally, there is sort of that comparison, which is a bit starker than on an IPS type model, between the region of the glow and the non-glowy region, so it can annoy some people. But as I said, it's not too bad on this model, and yes, it is exaggerated on the video, so it's sort of difficult to show you, but it is a feature and it does affect the atmosphere. I've now got a little bit of light coming in, and you can see glare on the screen, but actually it's exaggerated massively on the camera, on the video. It's not sort of blooming out that much. Actually, you can see some quite nice darkness to my eye. And this really allows you to appreciate the strong contrast without the VA glow becoming so overbearing. And this is why I don't recommend viewing any LCD panel type in a completely dark room in general. It just doesn't give you a nice experience. Even on ones with strong contrast like this, you're not going to get inky blacks or really nice deep dark shades throughout the screen. And it really, if you compare it to the black of the panel border, for example, there's just really no contest there. It isn't an OLED or anything like that, but it does still definitely provide an edge in contrast over other panels, over other competing models with IPS type panels and TN panels. And I feel it does work nicely on games like this. And not just games, I do watch a lot of movie content as well on Netflix and various other platforms, and I do enjoy the overall experience that this monitor provides, and I do certainly appreciate the stronger contrast. And I do actually talk a little bit in the written review, or write a little bit, about an example of a movie there in terms of the contrast performance. And I give some more specific examples using both this title and Battlefield 5 if you're interested. Just to round things off, the screen surface again, there's not like a nasty window of graininess or anything like that. Not quite as smooth as some screen surfaces, but again, it's something which I'm quite sensitive to. And I don't really feel it is something which detracts from the overall contrast experience. And I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction, and to start off I like to use the Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and their tests for viewing angles. They've got the Lagom text test, and that should appear a blended grey throughout the screen, ideally. On VA models like this, there's a sort of cone in the centre of the screen which looks quite grey and blended. Well, not in the centre of the screen, but in the region of the screen in line with the camera or your eyes. And further out, you can see that there is a bit of red striping to the text instead. And this cone does shift around alongside head movement, or camera movement in this case. And that is, again, gamma shift behaviour, quite similar to what causes the black crush, which I mentioned earlier. But what you don't get is you don't get this obvious gradient between green and very saturated red that you'd get on a TN model vertically, which would also shift very readily as you move your head. But on most IPS type models, this will appear a much more blended grey throughout the screen. Well, there might be a little bit of colour in places, but it doesn't have this kind of cone and this shift as you get towards the bottom corners of the screen and the bottom of the screen from a normal viewing position. The purple shade, it's a nice lilac shade throughout. It appears more pink towards the bottom of the screen and towards the edges, and again that pink sheen shifts with head movement. So there are some viewing angle weaknesses, some shifts in colour representation and saturation levels, that kind of thing. But again, it's not as pronounced as you'd see on a TN model vertically, where you'd see it looking far too deep, the shade, further up, whereas further down the screen, the pink hue would be really very strong. The red shade looks a nice vibrant red throughout, or a fairly rich red. Looks kind of more of a burnt red towards the bottom, a little bit of a pinkish hue towards the bottom corners. So again, some of the viewing angle weaknesses, but not as pronounced as TN models. The green block, good solid green throughout, saturated chartreuse shade, and it's got an interesting shade because On models with wider colour gamuts, it tends to look more of a pure green, whereas on models with a narrower colour gamut, the yellow hues tend to dominate more and it looks kind of yellowish, a bit like a tennis ball, I suppose. To give you an extreme example, on this one it verges a bit more towards the green end. This model does have a bit of extension beyond sRGB, as I'll talk about shortly, and that means that the green hues are highlighted a little bit more, but it is still a bit of a yellowish green overall, and it has more of a yellow hue towards the bottom of the screen. And again, that does shift a bit with head movement, but there isn't this obvious gradient you'd see on the TN model where it looks really quite rich and deep at the top, and lower down it really loses that completely and looks completely faded and very yellow. The royal blue block is a good royal blue, as it should be, throughout the screen. No obvious issues there, although it is worth mentioning that uniformity issues can affect this. And I should have really mentioned before, I'll just add this in quickly, when I was talking about contrast before, and I was talking about VA glow, uniformity issues can also affect that. My unit does have a bit of clouding, and you can see an example of that in the written review when I talk about backlight bleed and clouding and dark uniformity. If you do have a unit with lots of clouding, then it can actually bring out the VA glow more strongly. If you're using a high brightness setting, it would also bring out the VA glow more strongly. And if you're sitting close to the screen, or you're sitting higher up relative to the screen, then that will all bring this VA glow at the bottom of the screen out more strongly. The reason I mention this is that there can be uniformity issues which can affect the representation of shades, but I do prefer to focus more on the viewing angle performance because that is consistent for all CG27G2s or 27G2Us, whereas uniformity is really an individual unit thing. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. The monitor's colour gamut extends a bit beyond sRGB. I measured 90% of the DCI-P3 colour space, and that means that for content like this, which is created with the sRGB colour space in mind, and this applies to most content you'll consume, including lots of images you look at on the internet, they're really created with the sRGB colour space in mind. So if you have a colour gamut which extends beyond that, you get some extra saturation and things appear a bit more vibrant and a bit more saturated than they should. But the sRGB colour space is very restrictive, so some people do like this look, this extra vibrancy, but as I said, 90% DCI-P3 colour space coverage, so it isn't a massive amount of extension beyond sRGB, and certainly isn't as much as I've seen from some models recently. So it really just gives you a bit of an edge in the vibrancy and saturation. So there's still a nice range of shades, so it isn't the same as you'd get if you, for example, increased NVIDIA's digital vibrance control or increased the saturation levels using the OSD. This monitor, for example, has a game colour setting. This is a digital saturation enhancement. So if you increase that, what it does is it pulls shades close to the edge of the gamut, crushes everything together, it doesn't expand the gamut itself, and it really just gives a very weird cartoonish look. You avoid that with just an increased colour gamut instead. It's very difficult to actually show the colour representation on a video for the reasons I've mentioned before, but if you're interested in this, the saturation levels and also some of the colour consistency issues which I've highlighted using Lagom earlier, and I'm going to talk about a little bit in game very shortly. If you're interested in all of that, in a bit of a more scientific approach to this, a bit more representative, then I use the Spider Checker 24 system in the written review, and there's a section at the end of the colour reproduction section showing you some really nice visual examples of how this monitor represents shades versus how they ideally would be shown within the sRGB colour space. So yes, a nice range of quite rich looking autumnal reds and browns, fairly decent lush green shades. Some aren't as luscious and deep as on models with an even more generous colour gamut, and there is a bit of loss of saturation towards the edges and the bottom of the screen, as I showed with Lagom earlier. But something I find with models with a wider colour gamut, some of these brown shades, such as the tree trunk here, it naturally has a slight reddish hue to it, but it really looks far too rich, far too much of a rich reddish brown on models with a really wide colour gamut. On this one there's a little bit of that going on, but it's not extreme at all, so actually it looks quite natural. So a little bit of extra red, but it doesn't look too off really, it kind of looks more or less as it should. But there is some loss of saturation, as I mentioned, in some regions of the screen. So if you focus on the central region of the tree trunk, where my crosshair is at the moment, You compare it there, it's quite a rich reddish brown, and again this isn't necessarily going to come across on the video properly, but you'll be able to see the relative difference when I display that same shade lower down the screen, hopefully. It sort of looks more flooded. It sort of loses the red hue. Actually looks a bit anemic really, a little bit less saturated than it should towards the bottom of the screen. So the actual shade should really be somewhere between how it appears there and how it appears there. But again, definitely check out the Spider Checker 24 system, because I give loads of examples of shades and how they appear on the screen and how it's affected by colour consistency. Definitely worth looking at that. I did actually try to include a section in the video review, but it wasn't capturing it properly once I'd taken the video and all the processing that was done, etc. It really just lost the information I was trying to convey in the first place. So the nice pictures are a much better way of showing that. So overall, I think that users are going to find the output of this fairly vibrant, not super vibrant. So it's more kind of rich and natural, as I'd describe, with a bit of extra vibrancy. I think this is a kind of look that many will like. And the saturation losses that I talked about, the colour consistency issues, they're not as extreme or pronounced as they are on TN models where you're looking at them vertically. So this green here, for example, it does lose some saturation lower down the screen, looks richer towards the centre of the screen or higher up from a normal viewing position. But on a TN model, it would actually look far too dark higher up the screen. Lower down the screen, it would look completely flooded and just washed out, so you do avoid that. But it is worth mentioning that these shifts are more pronounced if you're sitting close to the screen. So I tend to sit around 70 centimeters from the screen, so what I talk about here and what I write about in the written review, it's really how things would look from around 70 centimeters. It doesn't necessarily change drastically if you're sitting a little bit close to that, and if you're sitting a little bit further away, the consistency is largely similar. But it is worth being aware that viewing distance and indeed the angle does affect this. And if you look at the viewing angles video, I've actually got a nice little clip from this game showing how the viewing angles affect the representation of things off angle, not just considering from a normal viewing position. So definitely check that out. And it's actually a new addition to the viewing angles videos because I think it's nice to show some in-game examples there rather than just looking at the desktop. If you do prefer a more muted look to the image, you could activate an sRGB emulation setting. If you change color temp to sRGB, that activates an sRGB emulation mode, and that restricts the color gamut so it more closely follows the sRGB reference space. It's worth being aware though, because of the saturation losses I've talked about further down the screen and towards the edges, some shades just appear quite anemic there, and there's actually a bit of undercoverage in some regions of the gamut as well. It's explored in the written review in the colour reproduction section. And again, just to draw attention to the Spider Checker 24 system, it also gives a comparison of the monitor running the sRGB mode versus using its native gamut. So that will give you a really nice representation of how shades look with both, much better than you'll see on the video. An alternative, if you like a little bit less saturation, but perhaps you find the sRGB setting goes too far, or you find it too restrictive because you can't even change the brightness or the color channels, so it's really quite restrictive, the sRGB setting. What you can do, it's not quite the same, and it's not quite as accurate doing it this way, but you could just reduce the game color setting a little bit. So if you set it to perhaps even 9, it just takes a bit of edge off the saturation, but what I find is it kind of undersaturates shades a little bit too much, and some shades retain a little bit of extra saturation. But the point is, this setting is there to adjust according to preferences. I don't think many people would like to go completely monochrome, but if you do, then you can do that with this. So it's a nice little flexibility to have. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to focus on the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 144Hz refresh rate, and I've got the game running at a good solid 144 frames a second. What this means is the monitor is outputting up to 2.4 times as much information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz. And apologies again for any moire you can see from the camera, so those little dancing lines, not visible on the monitor, don't worry about them. But what this means, the 144Hz refresh rate, 2.4 times as much visual information every second, it has two main advantages. One is that it reduces the perceived blur. Now there's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, and this explores the concept of perceived blur. But basically there are two main components to this. One is the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen, and that's very heavily linked to the refresh rate of the display and the frame rate of the content. So you get a nice reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement at this 144 Hz refresh rate and suitably high frame rates. So that's nice. You also get an improvement in what I call the connected feel, and that describes the precision and the fluidity when you're interacting with the character, when you're interacting with the game world. And this is something which low input lag alone doesn't achieve. So if you had a 60 Hz monitor with very low input lag, you wouldn't get this same precision and connected feel. It's really more to do with how much information it's pumping out at you every second. But input lag is still important. It is an important aspect of connected feel. Of course, if you've got high input lag, that can negatively affect the connected feel, and for some users that would be a very bad thing. This monitor doesn't have high input lag. I measured around 5 milliseconds. So whilst it's not super low levels of input lag, that's mainly because the pixel responses, which I'll come on to shortly, are a little bit slower on VA models like this, and the signal delay component, which is really the main element you feel when you're considering input lag, that's actually nice and low. So most users will find this just fine. Of course, if you're super sensitive to input lag and pixel responses and really that element of input lag more, then VA models like this can be a little bit problematic in that respect. But most users should find this just fine because it doesn't have a massive signal delay, and it does therefore for most people feel very nice. Pixel responsiveness is another aspect which affects perceived blur. Whilst it's not as important as eye movement, it is still very important, and weaknesses in pixel responses do certainly affect perceived blur. This monitor has a VA panel and they are known to have some slow pixel responses. This one isn't actually too bad. It does have some weaknesses and I'll come on to them shortly, but the scene I'm showing you here, the good old training range, I like to start with this because it's mainly medium to bright shades, and there are some dark shades mixed in. You can see the sort of shadowy areas and darker areas of rocks. And with these darker shades, there are some weaknesses, and I'm going to explore these in more detail with another scene shortly, but you can probably see this sort of slightly smeary look to the trailing, or what I'd call heavy powdery trailing behind the object, so to the left of that brick there, for example. Should hopefully come across on the video. It's not extreme though, it's not like a kind of smoky effect that you get with some really very slow VA models. There's nothing like that going on. But for these medium to lighter transitions, it's mainly fine. You get a little bit of what I call light powdery trailing. So there's just a little bit of a sort of very light powder behind some of these bricks, for example. Sort of like a faint trail, if you like. It sticks quite close to the object and it's quite faint. It's probably too faint to come across on the video, to be honest. But ideally that wouldn't be there. It does just add a little bit to perceived blur, but not a huge amount. There's also a bit of overshoot for some transitions. So usually where there's bright to medium to bright shades, this is where it comes in. So behind this object there with the light sand in the background, there's a little bit of halo trailing. That means that the trail is actually brighter than the background colour and the foreground colour, and therefore it stands out a little bit because of that. This isn't extreme overshoot though, and there's not much. This is really just something that affects a slim range of transitions, and it's not super bright halo trailing, so it doesn't really catch the eye too much, and most users probably won't even notice it, to be honest. There's another example of it here behind this brickwork with the bright sky in the background. I'd wager this won't come across on the video very clearly because it's really not a very bright overshoot. You can see it a bit more lower down towards there perhaps. But I'm not really going to dwell on this too much. If you do want to get rid of this, for whatever reason you're really sensitive to overshoot, there is an option. You can go into the OSD and you can set the overdrive to, not off, I wouldn't recommend off, to mediums. So as you could see, I had it set to strong before, and that works very nicely at these good high refresh rates. But if you are sensitive to this overshoot, you want to get rid of it, use the medium setting, it disappears. Problem is, the overall perceived blur is increased quite noticeably, and this sort of smeary trailing I mentioned before, more extensive now, really has more of a smoke-like appearance to it now. So I would just recommend sticking to strong. So I'm going to set it back to strong now. I'm not going to show you the other settings. If you're interested in this, check out the written review. There's a section with some nice pursuit photography showing exactly what these look like and the differences between them and exploring that a bit more. So definitely check that out if you're interested in the differences between these. But really on the video, you're not going to see anything particularly interesting if I lower it further, and there's no reason to lower it lower than medium at any point anyway. I'm now on my favourite scene on Battlefield 5 for showing off these slower pixel transitions. So there's a lot of darker shades involved now, lots of darker shades and dark to medium shades, and these really exploit your typical VA weaknesses. So with this model, you can see more of that smeary trailing around the boats there, for example, around the flag here, the flag post and the flag itself. And there's some further examples up here with this makeshift roof behind the little point there, for example. There's something of a smeary trail. This is actually what I like to call breakup trailing, and that's because some of the hues contained within the shade leach out a bit, so there's a bit of a kind of blue effect going on here. It's not just a sort of dark or black trail. It's not necessarily hues contained within the object, but it can also be hues in the background as well. So there's sort of this bluish grey sky there, combines with the darkness to create this interesting kind of stuff I like to call breakup trailing. It's a bit like wetting a page with some water-soluble ink on it. Kind of runs, the ink runs a bit. With the flag here as well, more of this smeary trailing. Quite a lot actually, and around the tree. What I would say is that overall, this monitor is probably sort of quite a middling performer for VA models. It isn't as good as the AOC C24G1, even using its medium setting for overdrive and certainly using its strong setting, although the strong setting on the AOC C24G1 introduces quite a lot of overshoot as well. So the C24G1 is stronger than this overall. But if you compare it to the AOC AG273QCX, this monitor doesn't have such widespread weaknesses, so it doesn't really have this sort of smeary look in as many places as you'd get it with the AG273QCX. For example, the AG273QCX used to have it more for these medium shades, medium to dark shades, so the perceived blur levels overall are a bit lower on this model in comparison, so that's quite good. I know it's something that can really put people off when I talk about this and people talk about this or think about smeary trailing, but the truth is that sensitivity to these kind of things does vary and not everyone is going to find it bothersome. If you do find it bothersome, then fair enough, but if you're not really sure if you find it bothersome, I'd say give this kind of model a go, because you might just love it and you might not actually find these kind of weaknesses distracting. And as I say, it's really confined more to these darker shades, so it's not everywhere you'll get this. When you're absorbed in a game, and particularly if you're not gaming competitively, perhaps it's quite easy to ignore these kind of things. I talk a little bit about some other game titles, just for some more examples and some more context in the written review. I use Shadow of the Tomb Raider there. There's lots of dark shades, but I actually still enjoyed playing that game on this monitor. Yes, I did notice these weaknesses, but I didn't find them annoying or distracting on that game. I didn't really feel sort of a competitive disadvantage because it's not a competitive game. But if you are gaming competitively on games like Battlefield 5, occasionally these sort of issues can be a little bit annoying. Depends on your personal preferences and sensitivities. I mean, I notice them when I'm playing Battlefield 5 and I would much prefer they weren't there, but I still perform quite well when I'm gaming on Battlefield 5 and I still get lots of benefit from the high refresh rate anyway. I've now turned the graphics settings up. You can see my frame rate, which is in the top right there, is now a bit close to 100 frames a second, or below 120 most of the time anyway. And that means that I have a bit of a drop off in connected feel, and I also have an increase in perceived blur just because the frame rate is reduced. However, this monitor does support adaptive sync, and that means that you don't get the sort of tearing you'd get if you had VSync disabled, and you don't get the stuttering you'd get if you had VSync enabled and your frame rate dropped below 144 frames a second when the monitor's set to 144 Hz. That would give you obvious stuttering if you had VSync on and no sort of variable refresh rate technology. So adaptive sync allows you to use AMD FreeSync as an AMD GPU or system user that's compatible with this technology, or you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. This monitor is actually certified as NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible in the driver, although it hasn't appeared on the website yet, just at the moment. It will probably appear in the fairly near future, but the reason it hasn't appeared yet is because the certification process is quite long, the full certification process, and the offices which need to do some of the paperwork associated with this, it's all under lockdown at the moment because of the current pandemic. So that is causing some issues and some delays. But this is actually NVIDIA G-Sync compatible and certified as such. But there are some issues to be aware of if you've got an NVIDIA GTX 10 series GPU. So I've got an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti I'm using at the moment. And when you're at these frame rates above 100 frames a second, so the monitor's above 100 Hz when you've got adaptive sync enabled, it's very nice to get rid of the tearing and stuttering, and there aren't any real issues. However, below that, there are some issues to be aware of if you've got a GTX 10 series GPU like I'm using at the moment. I've now increased my graphics settings. You'll see the frame rate is around 80 frames a second. With my NVIDIA GTX 10 series, well, one issue I have, and this does actually apply at high refresh rates as well, is there's a bit of flickering. It's generally where the frame rate's fluctuating a lot, and I've seen this a lot on VA models, so I didn't get this flickering with my AMD GPU, and I've done a lot of research into this, not just on this monitor, but others, and it seems that NVIDIA's RTX series, and I'd imagine upcoming NVIDIA GPUs, they seem to support NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode better. They don't have these kind of flickering issues. It really performs more like AMD FreeSync in that respect. And just thinking about AMD FreeSync on this monitor, the flickering was actually surprisingly mild. It wasn't really there at stable frame rates. It really required pretty significant fluctuations to set it off. And really the overall flickering was lower than I'd expect to see from VA models. So I was actually quite pleased with that. And as I said, I've done extensive research. It's included scouring forums and various other places in various different languages, translating things, and also speaking to users on my own forum. But I've got some good feedback suggesting that this monitor with the RTX series GPUs, like the RTX 2070 Super, that kind of thing, works just fine. G-Sync compatible mode. You don't get these kind of flickering issues. But there's actually a more pressing issue. I'm not getting it at the moment, and that is screen blanking. The reason I'm not getting it at the moment is just because the refresh rate is at a range which the monitor is quite comfortable with. But I'm just going to increase the graphics settings further, so I'll try and get another issue to come to light. Increase the graphics settings further. It's fluctuating between around 65 to 70 frames a second, and you can see the screen went blank, screen blank issues. So every now and then the signal will be lost, and this only seems to occur when it's below 100 frames a second, and it's quite rare unless it's below maybe 85 frames a second. I think it was just above the threshold for it to happen quite commonly, but unfortunately it does happen quite frequently when you're at these lower refresh rates, as you'd be when you're using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode and you've got the game running at these kind of frame rates. It just did 2 in a row there. I didn't capture it on the camera properly, but it did actually do 2 in a row. Everything went a bit blurry on the camera, so not great. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to avoid this. I do still use adaptive sync with my GTX 1080 Ti when I'm playing Battlefield 5, but that's because I can usually keep the frame rate above 100 frames a second quite consistently. But even then, there are some dips below this. If you go into the game menu, this can happen. Sometimes if you just zoom in with your scope, there can be sudden slowdowns, or there's lots of action on the screen. So it really can be quite annoying having these screen blanks. But as I said, the RTX 20 series, and I'd assume newer NVIDIA GPUs that aren't yet released, they shouldn't have this issue. And I didn't have this issue on my AMD GPU either, so it is restricted to certain GPUs. I have tried to notify NVIDIA of this issue, and I'm working with AOC to try and sort of nudge NVIDIA about it, because it isn't just something that affects this monitor. I've noticed it on others as well. The AOC CQ27G2U, for example, and others that aren't from AOC, similar issues. So it really seems to be something that perhaps NVIDIA could improve in the driver or fix in the driver. But it certainly can be quite annoying, as you can imagine, and some of the time you might just want to turn adaptive sync off if you've got a GTX 10 series GPU. Another thing to mention, hopefully I can mention it before the screen goes blank, is that at these lower frame rates and refresh rates, yes, the tearing and stuttering is still being removed, very nice, but there is a bit of an increase of overshoot. I'm not really getting any strong examples here, so I'll probably have to change the scene to something else. And the fact that I'm not getting any strong examples at the moment really is testament to the fact that the overshoot isn't ever really extreme on this model. but it does increase at these lower refresh rates. I think I've got quite a nice example behind the tree there, actually, some halo trailing, which wasn't there before. But I am going to switch to the scene I was showing you before, because I had some nice examples of overshoot even when I was running at 144 Hz. So I'll just switch to that scene. The game's now running around 60 Hz, 60 frames a second, so the monitor's running 60 Hz with adaptive sync enabled. And you can see far clearer halo trailing around the block there to the left. You could see that before, but it was quite faint. Now it's really quite eye-catching. Around this post here, some bright trailing, some halo trailing, which is brighter than the background and foreground colour by quite a bit. If you want to get rid of the overshoot, go to Game Setting, set the overdrive to medium, and it just did a screen blank on me. I'm not sure if I actually selected medium. And now it gets rid of the overshoot, or certainly reduces it significantly. And the screen has fits of screen blanking, unfortunately, with my GTX 1080 Ti, which is very annoying when you're trying to record a video. However, the perceived blur is significantly increased. Even at these much lower refresh rates, there is a noticeable difference between strong and medium is suboptimal for the pixel responses even here. And even with strong, there are some, the sort of smeary trailing I was talking about before. I definitely would check out the pursuit photographs in the written review for more specific examples of how this varies. But, I can't really pick it up from the video, but I can certainly see some weaknesses even using the strong setting, but with the medium setting, they are increased. So I've got it set to the strong setting again, and the frame rate is around 100 frames a second, so hopefully I won't get too many screen blanks, because that can be very annoying when I'm trying to describe and show something on the video. But you can still see, or I can certainly see, the sort of smeary trailing still there. But if you're interested in some more specific comparisons between the different refresh rates and how the trailing might appear, then the pursuit photographs in the written review are well worth looking at. I wouldn't set this monitor, for example, to 100 Hz on purpose if you're able to get a higher frame rate, because you will still get these weaknesses. Yes, they might not be quite as apparent in some instances because the pixel response requirements are indeed decreased at lower refresh rates, but you do still get them. And I think if you notice them at 144 Hz, you're generally going to notice them at 100 Hz as well. And there are certainly still some benefits for those faster pixel responses, and just in terms of the overall decrease in perceived blur due to eye movement and the connected feel from higher frame rates and refresh rates. Another trick up this monitor's sleeve is that it has MBR, motion blur reduction, a strobe backlight technology. I'm not going to spend too long going through this in the video, and that's because all you're going to see in the video, first of all, you have to have adaptive sync turned off for this to work. You can't use both technologies at the same time. You'll just see that the screen is now flickering. That's because it is a strobe backlight technology. The screen is flickering at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display. The written review goes through exactly what this does and gives some good examples in the game, but basically it significantly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. It's completely useless right at the moment, and that's because I am running the game at 110 frames a second and the monitor is at 144 Hz static. You get obvious stuttering because I don't have adaptive sync on, there's a mismatch, and there's very little perceived blur due to eye movement to mask this stuttering. So it really stands out like a sore thumb. You need to have the game running at a frame rate that matches the refresh rate, which I've now done. So it certainly does what it says on the tin, motion blur reduction, and it does decrease the overall motion blur. Again, you're not going to be able to see this from the video, but it significantly decreases eye movement, and that gives you a competitive edge. It makes enemies easier to track and engage, makes details sharper during rapid motion on the monitor, or even fairly slow motion. But there is quite a lot of strobe crosstalk, so that's to say repetitions of the object. And again, not necessarily going to see this from the video. It's why I generally don't really cover these sort of settings in the videos. But definitely check out the dedicated section of the written review. And there's also some pursuit photographs showing exactly what this does and how it decreases perceived blur, and also discusses the strobe crosstalk and other issues in more detail. I've got adaptive sync active now, and something I forgot to mention before, just a couple of things actually. One is that if you go to game settings, there is a frame counter. I do mention this in the OSD video, but it's worth mentioning here as well. So you can set that to right up, right down, or left up, depending on the location you want it displayed. And that will show you the refresh rate of the monitor. So it lets you know that Adaptive Sync's active, it's doing its thing, and the refresh rate of the display is trying to match the frame rate of the game. You will see some discrepancies because they don't update at exactly the same time. The polling is slightly different, but it does do that as much as possible. The other thing I forgot to mention is the floor of operation. So Adaptive Sync will work down to 48 Hz if you're using AMD FreeSync, and down to 60 Hz if you're using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Below this floor of operation, LFC is used, or what AMD calls LFC, low frame rate compensation. That means that the refresh rate of the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay, and this works nicely. There is a little bit of initial stuttering when you cross the boundary between LFC being active and not active. I noticed that on my NVIDIA and AMD GPU, but it's not extreme, and if you're not frequently passing this boundary, you're probably not going to notice it. So it does get rid of tearing and stuttering even if you're below 60 frames a second as an NVIDIA user, or 48 frames a second as an AMD user. To wrap up then, the design of the monitor, it's not too in-your-face gamery. It does have some dark red elements, but really they don't stand out much in practice compared to how they appear in press photographs or videos of the monitor. So I don't mind them. It's pretty blended appearance overall. Nothing too obnoxious in that respect if you don't like sort of gamery looks. Good ergonomic freedom as well. The curve, I really don't mind the curve. It's something which I'm perfectly accustomed to. I got used to it quite quickly. I've used quite a few curved monitors of various sizes and curvatures, and the 1500R curve on a 27-inch screen like this, it's not exactly a major feature. It's pretty easy to forget you're even using a curved monitor when you're using it. It's quite natural, just draws you in a little bit. The 2560x1440 resolution WQHD works very nicely on a 27-inch screen like this as well. Delivers a good pixel density, good amount of desktop real estate, quite a comfortable sort of level for people to run at good frame rates. And of course that's important on this monitor because it's a high refresh rate monitor. You want to get the most out of it. You want to be running at good high frame rates as well. In terms of the contrast performance, the main strength of VA panels like this, it helps deliver decent static contrast. There was some VA glow, so it lightened up things. If you're sitting in a fairly dark room and you're looking at dark content, there's a bit of sort of a bloom and lightening up towards the bottom of the screen. And it's something which 27-inch VA models like this often have, and just more broadly, quite a few modern VA panels do have this. It wasn't extreme on this monitor. It wasn't the lowest I've seen either, but it wasn't actually as much as I've seen on, for example, the Samsung C27G2 possibly a bit lower than the AOC CQ27G2U as well. But it obviously would be nicer if it wasn't there, but it is there. I still think that the overall atmosphere and contrast was nice on this monitor. It was good when I was watching Netflix, watching video content and playing games, including dark scenes in games. I found it quite nice, and I did notice an advantage compared to IPS type competitors, for example, or TN competitors to this model. It also handled the brighter content quite well. It has a light matte anti-glare screen surface, so it doesn't have a sort of obvious smeary graininess or a window of graininess to it, although the surface texture is not quite as smooth as some models. It's something which I've noticed on other high refresh rate 27-inch VA models before, so it's something I'm quite sensitive to. Most users are probably going to find it fine. It's not super grainy, just a little bit of graininess, which I can notice when I'm looking at lighter content. Again, something I'm sensitive to, not everyone really cares. The colour reproduction was quite good actually for the panel type. In terms of the colour consistency, I've used a lot of Samsung SVA panels, as is used on this monitor, and they're some of the stronger VA models in terms of colour consistency. There were still some shifts in gamma and colour, and the gamma shifts actually also create black crush, which really should have been mentioned when I was talking about contrast before. There was that, but not an extreme amount of it. And it also means that there's a loss of saturation when you look at a shade towards the edge of the screen and the bottom of the screen. Overall, though, the image was quite vibrant. It has a fairly generous colour gamut. I measured 92% of the DCI P3 colour space, so there's good extension beyond sRGB, and that does inject some extra vibrancy for most content. and it really gives a look which I think most people would describe as quite vivid. It doesn't really look washed out, certainly not in my opinion, although if you're comparing it to an IPS type model with very good colour consistency and perhaps even a wider gamut, so perhaps 95% or 98% of the DCI-P3 colour space, depending on the model you're looking at, then yes, it doesn't look as vibrant as that, but I would not describe it as washed out by any means. It also offers an sRGB emulation setting that worked well to restrict the gamut and give a look which is sort of more in line with the sRGB reference, although you have to be aware of those saturation shifts, so things do actually look quite washed out with that setting, especially towards the bottom of the screen or areas away from where your eyes are. And you're also quite restricted in that setting. You can't change brightness, you can't change the colour channels, so it's hardly ideal. In terms of responsiveness, the monitor provided good low input lag, certainly had a low signal delay, so didn't have any big issues there. Pixel responses were a bit of a mixed bag, as they often are with VA models. There were some pixel transitions which were a bit troublesome, giving some smeary trailing in places for the dark shades, very common on VA models. For the lighter shades and lighter to medium shades, the monitor did quite well actually. A lot of the pixel transitions were fast enough for an optimal 144Hz experience, or nearly fast enough, so a little bit of powdery trailing in places, but nothing too extreme. So it did actually deliver some good advantages, and the 144Hz refresh rate still delivered on its reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement, and it also delivered a good connected feel, and again the low input lag helped in that respect as well. Adaptive sync is supported by the monitor. That worked with AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Unfortunately, my NVIDIA GTX 10 series GPU had some issues which don't seem to be apparent on the RTX 20 series, and I wouldn't expect to be apparent on newer NVIDIA GPUs, but if you do have a GTX 10 series GPU, be prepared for some screen blanking and some flickering issues which you wouldn't otherwise get. The monitor also has a strobe backlight setting, MBR, motion blur reduction. That's something which I really explore more in the written review, and that's because it's not really very easy to show you what this does in a video. It's not actually possible to show you accurately what this does at all. But basically, yes, it worked. Motion blur reduction, it did reduce the overall perceived blur, but there's a lot of strobe crosstalk, so it was far from the cleanest strobe backlight setting I've used. So overall, I think this monitor is going to appeal to some people, especially because it's priced very competitively. It's below $300 at its MSRP in the US, for example, and I believe it's below €300 in European regions and below £300 in the UK. So it really does offer quite a lot of performance for that money. No monitor is perfect, and this is no exception, but I think it delivers a nice contrast experience, a decent colour experience, responsiveness, a bit of a mixed bag, and yes, it's not as strong as IPS type or TN competitors, but really compared to competing VA models, it's on par or better, to be honest, at least of the ones I'm aware of or the ones I've used. So I think really it does deliver quite a lot for the price that you're paying, and it's a monitor which is worth strong consideration. There were also some slight additions to this monitor which I quite liked, which I don't really discuss in the video review, but if you look at the start of the calibration section where I talk about subpixel structure, you'll see there were some improvements compared to the older variants of this panel, so that was nice to see as well. So that's really all there is to the AOC CQ27G2U or CQ27G2, depending on your region. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.